What is happening in Sudan right now, and what can we do? Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Muslims have been shocked the world over looking at fighting between Muslim groups in Sudan since the last few days of Ramadan, and even on Eid, subhānAllāh, and tensions are escalating. The fighting is happening between the country's official army on one hand and a paramilitary group called the Rapid Support Forces (RSF) on the other hand. Sudan is a very important country for the Ummah that we try to keep raising awareness about on Islam 21C. And to understand the recent violence, we've been speaking to experts to help make sense of it. And the rabbit hole keeps going deeper with some shocking revelations that the Western mass media simply aren't telling us. I spoke with commentator on Sudanese affairs, Dr Muhammad Elamin, who gave some very valuable insights about the history of the conflict, the internal and external parties involved, and importantly, what the solution is for the region, and also our role as Muslims watching from around the world.
So what on earth is going on? Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys?
The answer is, don't ask questions like that. It's an absolute dog's breakfast of competing regional and international interests at play on both sides, unfortunately. Okay, brief summary. Check this out. In 2018, there was mass disillusionment and widespread economic problems throughout Sudan, and strikes and protests began erupting all over the country. In April 2019, a coalition of rebel and civilian groups called Forces for Freedom and Change staged sit-ins outside the military headquarters, which led to a military coup overthrowing the president, Omar al-Bashir. Now, Western mainstream narratives have often described this as some enlightened secularists overthrowing the so-called Islamists. But the majority of people in Sudan are very closely attached to their deen, alhamdulillah, including the people protesting all over the country who just wanted to get by amidst economic crises. And the Forces for Freedom and Change did include some Islamic parties. However, one problem is that they are not weighted according to the number of supporters, as you'd expect in an actual democracy. Let's say you have one group with 5 members, for example, one analyst told me, compared to a group with 1 million members, they'd both have the same say. This made it notoriously easy to hijack the agenda with accused foreign interference too, and made them reluctant to host free and fair elections straight away, because they were afraid that the so-called Islamists would just win if they held elections. It doesn't sound very democratic, does it? Anyway, in April 2019, when the army got rid of the president, they formed a transitional military council, which included representatives from senior military officers, the RSF, who are fighting now, and other police and security officials. The protests still continued because the political parties were like,
Oh damn, we just overthrew a president and replaced it with a military rule.
So there was eventually, after a few months, a power-sharing agreement between military and civilian components to oversee transition to a fully civilian-led government, with a tussle now between some secularist parties with no doubt foreign interference and interests who were seeking to extend the transition to open elections so the Islamists wouldn't win, and some of the more Islamic-minded parties and groups, on the other hand, who wanted to hasten elections that included all groups, including the Islamic ones that they predicted would win due to widespread support. The more secular parties allegedly rallied around the RSF, whose general Hamiti would sometimes even accuse the military of being radical Islamists and that kind of stuff to position himself to receive more secularist support, allegedly. Now, a few years into this transition period, nearing the end, there were some agreements made to merge the RSF to bring it under the official army, which all parties reportedly agreed to. However, the recent fighting between the RSF and the military has put a spanner in that. Why did they start fighting? Depends on who you ask. There's a lot of domestic and foreign connections coming out of the woodwork, conspiracy theories and conjecture. Here's Dr Elamin to enlighten us a bit.
Now, coming back to 2019, al-Bashir, when the protests were becoming wider and there were calls for him to step down or not to at least run in the 2020 elections, he was becoming more suspicious or worried or paranoid about the army and whether some of his co-military officers might attempt to overthrow him and instigate a coup. And this is where he actually called upon the RSF to come into Khartoum. His view was to prevent a military coup. But interestingly, when that palace coup I mentioned happened in April, the RSF actually sided against al-Bashir. And they claimed that they were the ones who arrested al-Bashir and put him into house arrest, and then 10 days later took him. So that's how the RSF ended up from being just a Janjaweed militia related to the Sudanese army to a major power broker and partner. And it's also important to recognize that the RSF also mushroomed into a very large force, but with very substantial economic resources, because they were also the force which fought under the Saudi Emirati alliance in Yemen. It's reported or expected that somewhere in the region of 40,000 of their soldiers were involved in Yemen. They've been involved in the fighting in Libya and accused of fighting on the side of General Haftar. They've been also involved as recently as the turn of this year in Central African Republic, and it's been widely alleged that they fought side to side with the Russian Wagner mercenaries. So that kind of also introduces the regional factors at play with these forces. The civil war in Yemen, it was seen as a struggle for influence between Iran and its neighbors on the other side of the Gulf. The tragedy in that is similar to what's happened, for instance, in Libya, where internal political problems have had external actors become involved, and you have a form of a proxy war going on. You're the internal actor. You receive arms, you receive finance, but you're fighting it out on your own land amongst your own people. And if we're to use a classical Islamic term, I wouldn't think that there's a better example of fitna, and how fitna can be worse than actual murder or killing. Because these are societies which have lived, despite their ethnic, tribal, school of thought, madhab differences, for hundreds, over 1,000 years, side by side. So the fact that it's fallen to this form of bloodshed and disintegration means that there's a new factor which wasn't there over those hundreds of years, which has disintegrated the social fabric of these countries.
Do you think it's the nation state? The invention of the nation state?
The nation state will definitely be a major contributing factor. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you look at the map of Sudan, I mean, I was saying this to some friends before. If you look at the atlases or maps which don't have political borders, you'll find this wide stretch of land all the way from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Red Sea, which is known as the Sudan or Bilad al-Sudan. And the word Sudan itself just means land of the blacks. It's not a tribe. It's not a particular ethnic group. And even in the time of colonialism, there was the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which is nowadays Sudan, including South Sudan, which gained independence in 2011. But there was also what was known as the Francophone or the French Sudan, which is the Republic of Mali nowadays. And if you look at the borders, we don't have borders which are made by nature, i.e. they're not like mountain ranges or rivers or lakes or streams. And many of them are lines which are very straight on the map, by which probably somebody just drew a ruler across.
Yeah.
Now these lines have dissected the areas of tribes, of clans, of extended families.
Yeah.
So on the ground, they're not a recognized reality where on either side you have different languages or different religions. You pretty much have the same different people divided. And this has contributed to problems not just in Western Sudan in Darfur, but also in Eastern Sudan, because we have tribes between the borders with Southern Sudan, maybe to a lesser extent in the north. So definitely that is an important factor that we need to remain aware of and keep in the back of our minds when we're analyzing these conflicts. And certainly this tribal movement of these nomadic tribes all the way from Niger and Mali in search of pasture, how do you control it? How do you regulate it? This notion of you're not going to have your Heathrow Airport e-gates for them. It's not recognized. It's not adequate, and it wouldn't work. And these are lines of movement which have been well established for hundreds of years.
There you have it. These people lived together for 1,000 years despite their differences. And now we have all kinds of geopolitical interference. The West, UAE, Saudi, Russia, even the last remaining European colony in the Muslim world, Israel, has been trying to increase its influence via the UAE-led push to get Sudan to normalize relations with it, which is of course against the will of the general population, another region to squash democracy, so the so-called Islamists don't get into power. So in summary, the RSF fought for US allies Saudi and UAE in Yemen, which are pushing normalization with Israel, but they're allegedly also in bed with the US's enemies, Russia, alongside UAE, which is accused of helping transport African gold to Russia, bankrolling all kinds of stuff on either side of that transaction. That's not to mention Egypt, which has been supporting the Sudanese army, even though it contains elements inspired by the same Islamic movements that Egypt itself is fighting internally and squashing, because Sudan collapsing is an existential threat to Egypt's interest, which is also a US ally. Also because a vacuum in Sudan would cause a tug of war with Ethiopia on the other side, which is another US ally. See, it's a complete web of foreign interference based on nationalist self-interest, resulting from a bunch of imperialists drawing lines on maps.
What do you propose as the solution, or yourself as an analyst, or people on the ground in Sudan?
I think, in general terms, broad decentralization, federal structures of governance, giving local communities stronger and more power to govern themselves, and recognizing traditional forms of government. We have tribe leaders who have their ways of negotiating, of power broking, of conflict resolution. Empower them. We don't need to enforce a top-down form of government. Representative government is good, it's important, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a Westminster model. It doesn't necessarily need to be an American model or a French model. These are models which evolved in different parts of the world based on their social experiments, based on their joint history, based on their culture and developments. We need something which comes from our heritage, and we do have rich heritage.
That's a great quote I want to underline here. We need something that comes from our heritage, and we do have a rich heritage. So I asked him, how can we help watching this conflict unfold from afar?
Hundreds have died so far, thousands have been injured, millions affected. What can Muslims over here in Western nations do to help?
I think there's a lot that can be done. Going back to basics, starting from dua, making yourself aware and abreast of the developments and understanding their roots. On the day-to-day side of helping, again, charity, helping with relief and development. And also when we talk about relief and development, I think it's important to move from firefighting disasters to development, particularly with human development, with education and with infrastructure development, starting from simple things such as water and schooling and healthcare.
Okay.
There's always going to be a need somewhere.
May Allah make it easy for the people of Sudan and everywhere or across the Ummah.
There you have it, brothers and sisters. I told you it was confusing, but what is clear is this. Muslims are often caught up fighting all over the world based on nationalist interests and proxy conflicts between other powers. Western powers and their allies, or slaves, in the Middle East are constantly interfering with Muslim countries to establish their own interests. This Ummah has huge potential energy that we can use if we wake up, if we slowly work towards our own interests as an Ummah, freeing ourselves of all this neo-imperial and neo-colonial mess. There's lots for us to do. Don't just say, oh, wait for the Khilafah or wait for the Mahdi to come. We can strategically fund, for example, thought and development work towards strengthening cooperation and eventual reunification of Muslim countries and regions. And we should never belittle the role of dua and raising awareness of these things among the Ummah. There's an unscripted podcast episode coming up, for example, with Dr Awamir Anjum, who's working to spread a new discourse among Muslims across the world called Ummatics, to put the Ummah forward as a fundamental unit of analysis, for example, publishing research, carrying out conferences with experts, and all kinds of amazing and exciting work. But one thing Muslims in the UK can also do is weigh in on the discussions happening in the public right now about Sudanese refugees. Sudan has been famous for taking refugees for generations. How will the Ummah and the world treat the Sudanese now that some of them may be fleeing the horrors of war and conflict themselves? Let's raise our voices for our countries to treat them like they treated Ukrainian refugees, for example, or at least expose hypocrisy. I wonder if our politicians will treat Sudanese people like humans too.